We have some real problems in this country that are deep and structural, that have to be confronted with the truth of who we are.
I invite each and every one of you, listen to these different voices. Have the courage to say, let me see what this wrestling with white supremacy and black love is all about. In this class, we are going to be focusing on these powerful issues together.
You will learn how slavery and anti-Blackness is foundational to nearly every American institution in modern life, even if we refuse to see it.
You may hear things that you find hard to believe. They are a testament to parts of our history that we've dismissed.
The story that you can tell about this country, about it being a land of equality and opportunity, who gave America that? We gave America that.
There has been this unbroken history of struggle for liberation for hundreds of years. Black people managed to create beauty in the very process of fighting structural racism.
Black love is that thing that makes you believe in American democracy, even when American democracy hasn't believed in us.
One of our jobs is to try to make there be as little racism as possible. A more important job is to see where the racism is and think about ways that we can get past it.
Race is a fiction. Racism is real. What do we do with that?
And it's only in having that understanding of what built the country that we're in that we can dismantle the parts of our country that don't live up to its highest ideals.
I'm John McWhorter.
I'm Sherilyn Eiffel.
I'm Jelani Cobb.
Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Kimberly Williams Crenshaw.
Cornell West.
I'm Angela Davis, and this is MasterClass.
Good evening. I'm Kimberly Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. Together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we welcome you to this special Black History Month episode of our Under the Blacklight series. Now, you just saw a trailer from the MasterClass series, the excellent group of fellow teachers that you heard from. Some of them are with us tonight, and I was honored to go along for the ride. Now, around the country, this Black History Month has been marked by many celebrations about the myriad achievements of Black Americans across our entire society in culture, democracy, politics. In fact, just this past Friday, we witnessed another first when President Biden nominated Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to sit on the Supreme Court, the first Black woman in the 233-year history of the High Court ever to be nominated for the position. Now, this comes 55 years after the first Black person was nominated and 41 years after the first woman was nominated. Of course, the first Black person was a man and the first woman was white. Now, the celebration of this breakthrough takes place against an ominous backdrop, one that actually threatens to erase the very reason that Jackson was the first Black woman to be nominated in 2.5 centuries. The whitewashed version of history now coursing through the GOP, and we're seeing in battles over local and state school curricula, seek to create the impression that this historical gap is at best unexplained, or at worst, simply the product of a presumed fact that no Black woman has been qualified to sit on the Supreme Court until this very moment. And of course, for some, this moment still has not arrived. But we know this to be untrue. The history that makes this moment significant, as well as the living history that's playing out around the country in the recent trials of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd's murderers, in the resurgent efforts to disenfranchise Black voters, in the initiatives to criminalize Black protest, and by extension, to stigmatize the history of Black resistance and perseverance in the face of white oppression, is all history that is now under siege in the Trumpian universe and beyond. So since the fall of 2020, as the backlash against the George Floyd reckoning began to take shape, we've been in the throes of a nationwide anti-truth campaign that seeks to reframe anti-racism as racism against white people, not only in public schools, but in colleges and universities, in government, and in business. Framing these crackdowns on truthful history and academic freedom as an attack, a counterattack against a radical, un-American, indoctrinated CRT, legislators, school board members, state attorney generals, and an army of well-funded and highly coordinated operatives have laid siege to the knowledge and legacies forged in blood, struggle, and sacrifice of generations of Americans. We've seen bans of upwards of 700 books, including efforts to ban books about the civil rights movement itself, Martin Luther King Jr.'s struggle against segregation, as well as Ruby Bridges' autobiography recounting her experiences as a little Black girl in a recently desegregated school. We have seen autocratic dictates prohibiting any material that presents enslavement and segregation as anything but exceptional departures from the founders' inherent greatness. We've seen efforts to exclude any thinking that understands racism as anything more than individual prejudice. And we've seen employees challenge diversity training, implicit bias as reverse discrimination. There are specific efforts to eliminate an entire group of Black intellectual thought. We've seen teachers fired for teaching Ta-Nehisi Coates and Kyla Janae Lacey, school districts fined for teaching the 1619 Project, civil rights history lessons canceled, ethnic studies courses withdrawn, tenure of researchers and teachers threatened, and we've seen vigilantes armed with the belief that the teaching of Black history violates their children's rights, being deputized to hunt for teachers who refuse to whitewash our history. And they have found their mark. Parents have complained that Black History Month lessons and observations violate these bans. And teachers across the country have stepped away from critically engaging this history for fear of losing their jobs. So as we approach the end of the first Black History Month, commemorated under the vice grip of this anti-truth campaign, we must ask ourselves just where this campaign is heading. Our question tonight, is this the last Black History Month? Is necessarily a provocative one. Now, there are some who will accuse us perhaps of being alarmist. They contend that Black history can be taught provided we teach it within the imperatives that prohibit engaging in systemic racism, genocide, colonialism, and their contemporary significance. But given the full sweep of this moment of backlash, the draconian barriers to voting, the apparent impunity of mobs that descended on the Capitol on January 6th of last year, and the bomb threats sent to HBCUs around the country this year, the question isn't whether we are being too alarmist, but perhaps whether we're not being alarmist enough. So to answer these questions, we are honored to bring this amazing panel of some of the teachers from MasterClass to discuss all of this with you today. Jelani Cobb is a writer, author, and educator. He is the Ira A. Littman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and he's been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2015. His most recent book is The Matter of Black Lives, Writing from The New Yorker. Sherilyn Ifill is the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. She is a civil rights lawyer, an advocate, an author. In 2020, Ifill was named one of Glamour magazine's Women of the Year for her leadership of LDF, Attorney of the Year by the American Lawyer, and was honored with a 2021 Spirit of Excellence Award by the American Bar Association. And Cornel West is a philosopher, author, activist. He is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at the Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University, and has previously taught at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and the University of Paris, among others. He has written numerous essays for the Washington Post and the New York Times, and has authored 20 books. He's best known for his classic Race Matters and Democracy Matters. Now, throughout this Under the Blacklight event, we want to hear from you. Please share your thoughts in the chat room or tweet us at AA Policy Forum. You can expand the conversation across social media by following AAPF on Twitter and Facebook and using the hashtags Under the Blacklight. And you can send comments and questions also through YouTube, and we'll be uplifting them throughout this conversation. So let us get to it. Sherilyn, I'd love to start with you, not only as an amazing partner with AAPF on the Truth Be Told campaign to elevate the threat of these anti-truth bills, but also for you to link this work to one of the most moving parts of your masterclass. Now, before we play a quick clip about your passion for the 14th Amendment, can you say a few words about how some of this anti-truth legislation ties the legality of what can be taught to the comfort of white people?
Well, sure. First of all, thank you so much, Kim. This is an important discussion. So first of all, let me say at the outset, this is not the last Black History Month. So long as there are Black people, there will be a Black History Month. And I have no concern about that, but you are correct that there is an attempt to close the door on an engagement with the truth about our history in this country. The question you have to ask yourself is why, and I think the question you posed actually tees that up. And it is about the discomfort, and you had the statute up earlier, the discomfort, the guilt experienced by white people when they encounter the truth about what has happened in this country. Now, why was this something that was undertaken in 2020 and 2021? And I say 2020 because, as you know, this began with an executive order from President Trump that was challenged by LDF, which purported to stop all government agencies from really talking about race, from doing diversity training and so forth. That was the opening salvo. And then it descended to these various state statutes. And I really believe that what they are trying to get at is to try to close off the feeling among white people that change is necessary. Mm-hmm. The consequence of that feeling, of that empathy, when millions of people, white people, came out onto the streets after watching the torture, video, and killing of George Floyd.
Right.
They saw that that empathy has power. And in addition to wanting to shut off voting rights and wanting to shut off all kinds of avenues and access to power, they understand the power of people connecting with the truth and the story of our struggle in this country and the demand for liberation. Mm-hmm. And so they want to make sure that their children will not feel perhaps as they felt when they saw that picture of Ruby Bridges, right, when they were confronted by the truth about their parents, about their community leaders, about their grandparents, about the world that they lived in.
Mm-hmm. And Sherilyn, you put your finger on the relationship between what we saw, the amazing reckoning in 2020, the fact that in every state in the union, there was an outpouring, and then the backlash, which has been part of our history. It's inevitable. And we can understand and explain and historicize it. But what's so significant about this moment that you have elevated so beautifully in your masterclass is actually the 14th Amendment has something to say about this question of whether white comfort is enough to justify erasing aspects of this history. So let's hear some of your thoughts from the masterclass.
One of the reasons I'm on a crusade, if you will, to talk about the 14th Amendment and to help people embrace and understand the 14th Amendment is because I think we tend to talk about our right to be free from racial discrimination in this country in terms that are not constitutional. We talk about it as though it's about feelings, about whether people are fair to us or not, about the hearts of people and whether people are racist in their heart, whether they have a racist bone in their body, when in fact we ought to be talking about our right to be free of discrimination, our right to full citizenship, our right to full dignity as Americans, as constitutionally grounded, as compelled by the language of our foundational document, as intended by the framers of the 14th Amendment.
Just have to say I was loving that orange. I am always reminded when we've been in this, moment where somebody says your assertion of rights violates my civil rights. Remember in Eyes on the Prize, there's the white restaurant worker who said being forced to serve Black people would violate her own civil rights, right? So what is and does a fully realized historical understanding of the 14th Amendment and its importance to American democracy reveal about the white comfort limits that they're trying to place onto the teaching of Black history?
Well, you don't see it in almost any other instance in our country in terms of the relationship to a constitutional imperative and principle. Here it is, you have an amendment that sits between two other amendments, and it is created for the express purpose of ensuring that Black people, both free and slave, are full citizens of this country. It uses language that very rarely appears in the Constitution, no state shall, right? It is being very particular about what must happen, that there must be equal protection of laws, that everyone who is born here is a full citizen. It doesn't say anything about how other people might feel about the fact that we are full citizens, right? And yet so much of our discourse and so much of our thinking about what the limitations are of Black citizenship is very much dependent on what the boundaries are of how white people feel. We don't do this with the Second Amendment. You walk into McDonald's, there's a man standing there, he has an AK-47 on his back. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't know about you. But if you ask him why he has that large weapon on his back, will he say, because I feel like it, because it's fair to me, because it makes me feel good, because it shouldn't bother you that I have it on? He doesn't say any of that. He says, because it's my Second Amendment right.
Yeah.
He grounds that right in the language of the Constitution. And yet we go around talking about discrimination, which most Black people do talk about. We talk about it in terms of people being prejudiced against us or biased against us or being discriminated against or being treated unfairly. But we don't say they violated my 14th Amendment rights. We don't ground it in the Constitution itself. And that is part of the reason why we have impoverished the conversation about what we are entitled to as full citizens. And those who are engaged in this anti-truth movement in states all over the country and who have the audacity to say in statutes that if it causes grief or anguish or discomfort, it somehow is outlawed. They are able to do that precisely because we have left the power of the 14th Amendment on the table, because we have not fully grabbed it and fully utilized it and compelled respect for it in a way that allows white people to still believe that their feelings are more important than a constitutional amendment.
And that so much goes to the core recognition that losing history, not being able to tell what the deep and transformative possibilities were of the 14th Amendment. And Jelani, I'm coming to you in a minute on the 15th Amendment. Us not knowing means that the terrain that is partly there for us to struggle and to assert these rights, not as matters of the heart or matters of the mind, which is essentially what this legislation is trying to limit the exploration of racism to. There's some of those states actually say that to talk about or think about racial discrimination as anything more than prejudice is itself illegal. Well, it's basically trying to turn upside down what our actual rights are and subvert that into a consciousness basically around white people, which is not what racial discrimination is about, not what we are primarily focused on.
Kim, can I just say, I don't want to interrupt, but I just want to say, we should be clear that we were aided in this forgetting by the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Exactly.
You look at the first years after the enactment of the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court basically read us out of it and essentially took this amendment that was designed for us, for our full citizenship and dignity, and allowed it to be used by corporations and others, and weakened it in ways that did not allow us to fully embrace the promise of the 14th Amendment. But now it's clear we must do it or we are doomed.
And told us that to expect the 14th Amendment to do what it should do would be making us special favorites of the law.
Right. That's right.
Right? We are what, 10 years out, and basically to ask for more equality.
How long they asked in the civil rights cases in
exactly.
1883, you know?
So speaking of history, Jelani, it's often said, you know, the people who don't know their history are bound to repeat it. Mm-hmm. And leaving us in this sort of endless, repetitious recourse. And I think that there aren't really examples that are more poignant and tragic than the erasure of the Kerner Commission report, particularly how the report elevates some of the contemporary consequences. So let's play a clip of you discussing the Kerner Commission report.
Looking around, they said, we have these problems with substandard housing. We have these problems with unemployment and underemployment. And we have a real problem with the inability to access quality education. When all of these institutions are failing, it is not likely that people are going to have a good relationship with the police. And they saw this when they analyzed specific communities. They saw this pattern again and again and again. In fact, they said as many problems and as many concerns as possible should be spun off away from the police departments into other social service organizations that can address these issues. Because having law enforcement respond to non-law enforcement problems will generate potential conflict. The smallest, most mundane interaction can go awry and then have catastrophic consequences. That idea was ignored for decades and then reemerged in the aftermath of George Floyd's death in 2020, when people began saying that they should defund the police.
So Jelani, when you think about the shelving of the report, and now the contemporary efforts to shut down meaningful interrogations of this history, what becomes the significance of remembering, making history materially significant? What is this story telling us?
So the problem is, and first off, I'm always thankful to be able to speak after Sherilyn, but you know, it's an ambivalent feeling because Sherilyn leaves so little to be said after she's finished talking. But on the other side of it, she sparks so many ideas that you're really happy to engage. And so I promise I'm gonna make all this connect. I'm gonna give you 30 seconds on what Sherilyn's point raised for me. And so this idea that we have a system of democracy in which any instance to trying to remedy the white supremacist elements in it is used to the benefit of white people is deeply rooted. We talked about that case in 1850 of Celia, the enslaved Black woman who is repeatedly raped by her master, and who has the humble, simple, fundamental request that he not attack her while she is pregnant with his child, a request that he ignores, and she kills him in response. And that court says that she does not have the right to self-defense because if a Negro has the right to self-defense, that necessarily intrudes upon the rights of white people. And so you cannot be a slave and possess even that rudimentary element of your humanity, which is how we understand what the court is talking about when Justice Taney says that Negro has no right that white man is bound to respect. And so it's baked into their understanding of this. If we jumped a century forward and looked at the conflict over the civil rights legislation, when that Alabama Senator J. Lister Hill opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act on the basis of preventing discrimination from being written into the Constitution, written into our legal code. And the discrimination that he's talking about is not Negroes being violently attacked for the exercise of the most basic constitutional rights. It is not Negroes being locked out of housing. It is not Negroes being locked out of employment. It is not Negroes being forced into the substandard educational practices of segregation. It is the state stepping in to remedy these things. And the mere protection of Black rights is an intrusion upon white people's rights, which is the cornerstone of what John Roberts is talking about in 2013 when he says that the Voting Rights Act is discriminatory. He says, is the South more racist than any place else? That we are wrong for making this presumption that there needs to be protection in these places. And so we have this history, and that's how we get to Kerner, because the problem is that history makes the world make sense. And if history makes the world make sense, you then understand what is implicit in your time, what is your responsibilities implicit in the circumstances that are confronting you in your time. Just as Sherilyn's point was about George Floyd's death, and when people sought to look at the context, when in 1926, when Carter G. Woodson created Negro History Week, he was trying to create a context for Black humanity. When we go back and look at what Carter G. Woodson was talking about, he wanted there to be a context of Black humanity. This is the context that we are operating in. And we're in another century, nearly a century later, when George Floyd dies. And people start looking backward and going, how many dots can we connect to understand how this is? In 1968, when Kerner released that report, and these are 11 people on this commission, all of them moderate in their politics, 11 people, 9 of them white, 10 of them male. And they make the mistake of actually going to Black communities to examine the conditions. Lyndon B. Johnson created this commission. It was supposed to be a rubber stamp to simply say the problem is communist. And if the problem wasn't communist, then the problem was H. Rap Brown. It was Negroes talking, inciting violence. Until these people actually went to Cincinnati, and went to Cleveland, and went to Newark, and went to Detroit, and saw the circumstances that people were locked into and said, oh no, the problem is not this. And we can't even say that the problem is policing. The problem is the context that that policing occurs in. And so the Johnson administration, recognizing what that put on the table, shelved that report, pretended that like it never happened. But what has happened has been like a Freudian nightmare. When people say like you have a nightmare, then you continue to have that nightmare until the conflict that it represents is resolved, the underlying conflict is resolved. In 1980, when those police in Miami beat Arthur McDuffie, the Black motorist, to death, Kerner. In 1992, when those police officers beat Rodney King in a way that you would have been arrested if you had beaten a dog like that. We went back to Kerner. In 2014, when we saw Michael Brown's body laying in the street in Ferguson for 5 hours, dead, we went back to Kerner. When George Floyd, when we saw his death, that year when we saw Breonna and Ahmaud Arbery, we could have gone back to Kerner for Sandra Bland. We could have gone back to Kerner. There's a litany of these names. When you go to George Floyd Square and you see that spray painted litany of those names, every one of them could have sent us back to the Kerner report, because it's one of the rare instances in which American bureaucracy, not American scholars, because they weren't saying anything that W.E.B. Du Bois hadn't said, that Anna Julia Cooper hadn't said, these people who were making these points decades earlier, but American bureaucracy countenanced the intrinsic nature of white supremacy and the way it operates in American institutions.
And we haven't seen anything like that since, right? So
no, we have not, for that very reason. For a reason. And in fact, if we think about it, the Kerner Commission report might itself not be teachable in many of these states, because some of the legislation prohibits any kind of teaching that suggests that people today are responsible for some of the conditions that have been produced out of the past. So basically an effort to legislate away not only the right to remedies against structural racism, but even the ability to articulate it, that it actually exists. I want to come back, Jelani, and ask you, let's first hear from Cornell, but get a sense of how these histories have been so effectively erased, and in particular, some of the stories about that erasure that people like Derek Bell predicted. Let's get Cornell in, and then I'll come back.
Everybody, Brother Jelani flow.
I'll come back. Okay.
Brother West, I defer to you. To you.
No, y'all defer to me.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
All right.
Indeed, we do.
All right. So Cornell, I'm reminded of the passage in your MasterClass where you were discussing white supremacy. And one of the pushbacks against the terminology of white supremacy these days is that first, it's anachronistic. And secondly, it's a framework that targets and makes white people feel guilty. Now, Black love is not a discourse of recrimination or projection of responsibility. And it's not even exclusively about white people, as you note in this clip. So let's take a listen.
Because when people have told you for 400 years certain lies, those lies have effect. Because when people have told you for 400 years certain lies, those lies have effects. And that's why love is always a form of death. There can
So I'm Cornell.
be no black
I'm not a good Cornell West.
Attempt to promote.
So I'm gonna read the quote. You all hear Cornell West in saying this, but there can be no Black love without the attempt to promote the death of white supremacy inside of Black people. You also have to come to terms with the white supremacy inside of Black souls. You don't have to have white brothers and sisters around to see white supremacy operating, because it's inside of us. And so Black love requires an extricating of the white supremacy inside of Black people. As you attempt to kill that white supremacy inside of you, a stronger, more powerful Black human being emerges, but it's an endless process. So I wanted to bring you in about, the content of those internalized lies, and what is the importance of Black history education for critical self-awareness that is part of this endless process that you're talking about?
Well, see, I proceed on the notion that Black love is a crime in a white supremacist world. And therefore, you have to have courage to engage in a truth-telling and a justice-seeking such that you're willing to take a risk. Because if you love Black people, you're going to tell the truth, the full truth about their suffering, as well as the full truth about their joy, their resilience, their resistance. And I look at all three of you all, I see an example of what I'm talking about. Sister Kim, you are a marathon runner at the highest level of intellectual engagement. Sister Sherilyn, you are a marathon runner at the level of legal sharpness. Brother Jelani is a marathon runner at the level of what it means to intervene in the academy and in magazine life to tell some very painful truths about just how deep white supremacy as a form of not just pathology, but of barbarity. Because the lies are inseparable from the crimes. The mendacity is inseparable from the criminality. And so even when we cast it in a legal context, it's a legal context that we have to enter, but we're entering that context within the backdrop of crimes against humanity. That's what we're talking about when we talk about white supremacy, you see? So if you convince a people that they're less beautiful, that they're less moral, that they're less intelligent, that they ought to laugh when it ain't funny and scratch when it don't itch, and wear a mask in order to navigate through a mainstream and not able to straighten their backs up and tell deep truths that require us to take a risk, then white supremacy is still too strong inside of us. And we all wrestle with it because you can't grow up in a white supremacist world without being socialized into that world. I'd say the same thing about sisters in regard to patriarchy, but we won't go into that way. Same thing with our precious gays and lesbians and non-binary in regard to straight culture. It gets inside of us and we have to push it back. And that's why Black spirit, Black joy, Black music, Black culture, Black family, Black community, various forms of weaponry to push back those white supremacist lies inside of us in order to fight.
You know, Cornell, when we spoke the other day, you talked about the praxis of both truth-telling and justice-seeking, how that is part of the core experience of Black people who have suffered, and through that suffering, bring forward not just liberationist ideas for Black people, but for everyone. And one of the puzzles about that is that the allegations against Black history, Black liberationist thought is that it is not universal. It is just about us. While on the other hand, the ideas about universalism that have underwritten a very exclusionary history go unmarked. How do we make sense of how this continues to happen? And what's the role of history in helping us see what truly has been the contribution of Black folk to the very aspirations that shape this so-called multiracial democracy?
The Black freedom struggle has been the leaven in the American democratic loaf. It's been the very thing to keep America from going fascist. If it wasn't for the Black brothers and the 200,000 brothers who joined the army, the Confederacy could have won. If it wasn't for Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker in the 1960s, there actually could have been a George Wallace and a host of other neo-fascists who moved to the center of the American stage. We're now experiencing that with Trump and company, the escalating neo-fascist sensibilities and movements. And keep in mind now, you see, that when I say the leaven in the American loaf, I'm talking about universal truths like integrity, honesty, decency, courage, vision for the dignity of all. That's what's inside the best of the Black soul, the best of the Black movement, the best of the struggle for Black freedom. So the deeper you get inside of the particularity of Blackness is the closer you get to the universality of the best of the human spirit. They go hand in hand. And Brother Jelani was talking about Ben Webster. You can't get more sweet and lovely and delicate and sophisticated and subtle and sound than that. And you could be an Eskimo, you could be a Liberian, a Siberian, or a Ukrainian. He's going to touch your soul. But he's going to touch your soul because of the genius that's flowing out of his own Black context, Black family. And it helps to have some good friends who are jazz musicians to teach you how to play in a very smooth and sophisticated manner.
And speak in a smooth and sophisticated manner. I want to thank everybody for getting us started here today, and we'll be moving on to another segment. But before we do that, I'm going to ask AAPF's Creative Arts Administrator, Owoye Tempo, to give us a brief rundown about what we've been hearing online so far, and then we'll move to the roundtable discussion. Owoye.
Hey there, Kim.
Hey.
Thank you so much. As you can imagine, we have an incredible and very enthusiastic group in the chat tonight, just so excited for this conversation. Someone highlighted early on that Black women in the late 19th century were the heart and soul of American democracy, but they were silenced by both white and Black patriarchy. There are a lot of comments about the historical erasure and the intentions of the erasure. One person said they don't want white children to be pissed at their adults because they have been lied to for all of these years, which was echoed by why do they think their children are too weak to learn the truth? So Jelani's point that the mere protection of Black rights is an intrusion on white people's rights really resonated with folks. On another point, someone said, I love what April is saying about how people feel about guns, but the Second Amendment rights are not shut down because of that. However, the 14th Amendment is because of feelings and fears. Great point. And then there are also a number of questions and a number of proposals. Someone said, we talk about the backlash. If we do ground the 14th Amendment the way we need to, will they work to repeal it? So it's a really great group in the chat. Everyone's really grateful to be part of this dynamic conversation. So I'll toss it back to you, Kim.
Thank you, Owoye. So we've begun with some review of some of the MasterClass clips. We really encourage you all, if you haven't seen the MasterClass, take some time and just sit with it. It's free on Amazon Prime for another 5 hours or so, depending on where you are. It's an excellent, excellent immersive opportunity to sit with and understand the significance of so many of the histories that have shaped this present, that have facilitated our survival, and that are now under threat of erasure. So watch it, listen, and learn. Jelani, let me come to you to pick up some of what you were going to put in the mix, and ask as you do so to tell us, talk a little bit about what the meaning of the 15th Amendment, the true story about that, helps us understand about where we are in this moment politically. There's so much about the way that the African American vote, our enfranchisement, our disenfranchisement is in some ways historically resonant in this particular moment, but we can't really understand it if we don't really have a true sense of that history. So share with us some of how you were talking about the 15th Amendment in MasterClass.
So it's important to think about this, the context in which Black people attained the right to vote, particularly in the South. And this goes back to what Derek Bell was talking about, the interest convergence theory, that Black people have made advances when it was in the interest of white people for us to do so. There have been these concessions that were self-interested. And so when we look at the history of Black people and our access to the ballot after slavery, we have to understand that the South, for all of its history, before the war and after the war, was, because of the 3/5 compromise, disproportionately powerful. Had the political power. There were 5 million white people in the South, 4 million Black people who were enslaved in the South. But you counted 60% of that Black population for the purposes of representation, so the 3/5 compromise meant. And so those 5 million white people had the political power of 7.4 million white people. And they took that excess political power and tore the country in half. And so after the disastrous toll of the Civil War, 720,000 people dead, almost double the number of people who die in modern 20th century industrial warfare, 720,000 people dead. The main concern of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party is that the South never have the power to tear the country apart again. And so they reasoned correctly, Abraham Lincoln, before he dies, in 1858, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which I know there are people out there saying that Lincoln was debating Frederick Douglass instead of Stephen Douglas, which I think that is important. It's important because Frederick Douglass has had more posthumous accomplishments than any of us we can name. So Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln are debating, and Abraham Lincoln says outright, "I do not intend to make voters of Negroes in any place where they are not already voters." After witnessing the carnage of the Civil War, Lincoln says the only thing that can protect democracy is Black people with the ballot. And they reasoned that there had to be some counterbalance effect, that Black people would vote against the interests of the former slaveholders, and that this could blunt the political power of white supremacists in the South. But what that also meant was that Black people's necks would be put on the line, that we would be the firewall, as Brother West was saying, that we would be the firewall between America and fascism. And so the 15th Amendment, when it is ratified in 1870, to be succinct about it, is a political mechanism meant to have Black voting power forestall the power of a white supremacist movement that threatened to destroy American democracy. That is the reason, and Dr. King talks about this explicitly in 1965 when they're in the midst of that Selma to Montgomery march. He says that people in the South, the white supremacist forces in the South, understood that if they were to enact their agenda, which by the way was an agenda that overwhelmingly favored rich people across the board and disadvantaged poor people of both races in the South, and if they wanted to enact this regressive agenda, they had to eliminate Black people from voting contention. And so this is how we see the rise of lynching. This is how we see the terror campaigns that remove Black people from political contention. And when we get into the 20th century and the momentous achievement of the Voting Rights Act, from the Voting Rights Act, the outset, from the moment the ink is dry on it, there's a campaign to push it back because they understand what Black political power means. And so when we were looking at those returns, and all of us were sitting on the edge of our seats, hoping, we were looking in Georgia and looking at Fulton County, that county where Atlanta is overwhelmingly populated by Black voters, and saying that the future of American democracy might hinge upon what Black voters do in Fulton County. We were seeing a replay 150 years later. The chance to defeat Donald Trump came down to Black voters. Once again, a century and a half after the 15th Amendment was ratified, people are hoping that Black political power will stand between the United States and a white supremacist movement that threatened to destroy American democracy. That is why it's crucial to understand the context of these efforts to suppress Black votes now. That is the logic. And for that matter, with what we're saying about history, this is why people don't want this history taught, because the history makes the present make sense.
And so on that very note, making the present make sense, Sherilyn, one of the core arguments in part of this idea that the 2020 elections were being stolen were actually allegations against Black voters and voters of color. A lot of people, don't really make much of the fact that the Confederate flag went into the Capitol, symbolizing the sense that these people were fighting to recover what was theirs, right? And part of the point of where they felt that they had lost their country was focusing on voters in Atlanta, in Philly, in Milwaukee, in Detroit, in Arizona, where Latinx voters made the difference. So that the very idea that this election was stolen, the very big lie, is pointing the finger in the same direction as disenfranchisement in the past. But the thing is that in many of the conversations that we read in, sort of the papers, the connection between the attack on voting and the attack on history and the attack on truth and the attack on the Capitol are kind of seen as, not linked, separate phenomenon. So help us connect the lines. How do we connect the dots between this, all of these elements of what's happening now?
I'm so glad you raised this, Kim, because this part is really important. One of the things I have been railing against is the effort to cast and discuss voter suppression in purely partisan terms. In other words, to take the racism out of voter suppression when it is largely a white supremacist project. And so this conversation, as though it's just about a tussle for power between Republicans and Democrats, and even worse, the sense for many people that somehow it started with Trump, is a way of suppressing that history once again. So let's take it back. Jelani was just telling us about what people understood was going to be the importance of the Black vote as a bulwark against white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
What that means they also understood was that white supremacy would continue to reconstitute itself and attempt to assert itself. Frederick Douglass talked about this when he said why Black people, Black men, had to have the vote, because he said they will do it again. They will once again think about what their fathers and their grandfathers told them, and they will once again reconstitute. And when they've rested a little while, they'll be back trying to do exactly what they did before. So he understood what the white supremacist project was. What's so fascinating about the Voting Rights Act is that white people knew what the white supremacist project was. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Voting Rights Act, and in particular, you look at the passage of the provision that the Supreme Court struck down in 2013 in Shelby County versus Holder, which was Section 5. This was the preclearance section that required certain jurisdictions to submit any voting changes they wanted to make to a federal authority to get approval for it before they could put it into effect to determine whether or not it would be discriminatory. If you read the Senate report that accompanied the passage of the act, what you will find is that the Senate committee said about the preclearance provision of Section 5 that it was designed to get at and to protect against discrimination happening in that moment, but also the Senate committee said to get at, quote, ingenious methods that might be used in the future. Mm-hmm. In other words, in 1965, even then they didn't have a law that said you can't give water to people standing on line, right? That's the ingenious method that they came up with after those Black voters that Jelani was talking about stood on line for 9 hours in Fulton County to vote in the presidential primary. Voter ID was not the issue in 1965, right? Voter purges were not the issue in 1965. But the Senate committee passing the Voting Rights Act knew that even as we're passing this monster piece of legislation that is designed to ensure that Black people can vote as full citizens, that the South and the jurisdictions covered by the Voting Rights Act, by Section 5, will come up with ingenious methods in the future to do the same thing they did 100 years ago in Reconstruction, that they've been doing now, they're going to do it in the future. So when John Roberts strikes down Section 5 in Shelby County versus Holder and says it's because the South has changed and because now we are dishonoring these states by compelling them to be part of this preclearance regime, he is elevating himself above the 2006 Congress that reauthorized the act. He is elevating himself above the 1965 Congress that passed the act with the understanding that we needed a way to get at ingenious methods in the future. And he's elevating himself above the Reconstruction Congress that recognized all the things that Jelani just talked about in terms of the 15th Amendment. So what we are seeing and what we saw on January 6th, for many people, they said, we have never seen anything like this before in the country. And many of us were thinking about Colfax.
Yes, right.
Many of us were thinking about, this used to happen at the state level. I have said that we are witnessing the Alabamification of the nation. What was limited to the states, and this is the lesson, is that whatever is being workshopped on Black people, to the extent that white people are saying, well, that's Black people's problem, or that's only in Alabama, or that's only in the South.
Right.
Well, now it has come fully to America. Now it has come to Michigan, and it has come to Wisconsin, and it has come to Pennsylvania, as it always will, if you don't address it wherever it rears its head. And so I am more distressed with the people who we couldn't get to listen to us in 2014, when after preclearance was lifted, Texas said, we're going to pass a voter ID law that we couldn't get pre-cleared 3 years ago. We're going to pass it now that we can. And we're going to say that here's all these forms of ID you can't use. You can't use your tribal ID. You can't use your HBCU ID, but you can use your concealed gun carry permit. North Carolina said, we're going to pass this omnibus voter suppression law that the federal circuit court said the provisions were put together with surgical precision in order to keep Black people from voting. And what I was saying then, and there are a million clips of it, I was using the words white supremacy to describe the fact that federal courts found that in Texas and in North Carolina and in Wisconsin, laws were passed for the purpose of keeping fellow citizens, Black citizens, from voting. That is white supremacy. We didn't start using the term more regularly in this country again until Charlottesville. White supremacy is also absolutely white people walking with torches and menacing the population and carrying flags with swastikas on it and doing Nazi salutes. But it is also the legislature of Texas meeting and passing a law intentionally designed to keep Black people from being able to exercise their rights as full citizens. And it was the failure of moderate people and mainstream people to understand in 2014 that that was white supremacy that actually left open the door for what then happened in 2016 and 2020, which were the first two presidential elections without the protections of the full protections of the Voting Rights Act since 1965. It was the failure to heed the alarm because they had gotten so used to the idea that what happens down in some southern states to Black people has nothing to do with American democracy.
I am so glad that let's just have the moment for the mic for me to pick it back up. Thank you very much. That was amazing, Cheryl. And because, you first bring the history that I was thinking about when we heard so many people after January 6th say, that's not who we are. And I'm wondering, what history have you been reading? What part of race and reunion and lost cause rises again have you not been aware of? Of course, this is exactly who we are. The only difference is that this violent political counter-revolution was played out against Black people and against white people who supported Black people. So many people say, well, could it happen here? And they mean, could authoritarianism, could fascism happen? And I'm saying again, whose history are you not reading? What was 7 decades of white supremacy? But authoritarianism, fascism under a white supremacist frame. So much of the challenge now is making the fact that so many of our friends did not recognize the threat when they should have, and allowing them to see what threats they are not recognizing now that they should have, particularly the way that all of these things are coming together. So Cornell, I'm going to come to you to conclude this section. What are some of the dynamics that we can see historically playing out again and again and again, that first of all, most people seem not to be aware of. But secondly, as Jelani says, there's an interest in making people unaware of it. And there's a threat in us not rising to this moment of erasure. So help us think about what this moment is, what its relation is to, say, McCarthyism and other moments in the past.
Yeah, I mean, one is that, we got so much truth telling here tonight. I think it's very important, though, when people talk about telling the truth or speaking truth to power, it's often just as important to speaking truth to Black people. And speaking truth to ourselves, because we don't want the white gaze, we don't want white fears, insecurities, and anxieties to ever be center stage, ever. It's just on a human continuum like everybody else, just like the jazz musicians, the other musicians on the human continuum. They are not center stage. And that's important. Why? Because the younger generation, and Brother Jahan Sharif put this MasterClass together, young Black brother still in his 20s. He about the same age as when Garvey founded UNIA, 27 years old, right in Jamaica. It's a young people's movement. And why is it important to say that? Because young people are the ones who have to come up with keeping alive the best of our great tradition, which means they have to have courage, they have to have hope, they have to have wisdom, they have to have a willingness to sacrifice. You don't gain access to the greatness of our tradition by means of osmosis or as means of automatic upward mobility. That ain't happening. You ain't gonna blow like Ben Webster, just playing your scales. You're gonna have to explore the dark corners of your own soul and transfigure that suffering into something of sonic beauty and delicacy. So it is in our movement for freedom. And so what we're talking about in this broader sense is this situation right now, escalating neo-fascist Republicans explicit, milquetoast neoliberal Democrats who oftentimes are MIA, missing in action unless the Black voters push them. And it was Black sisters this time. Now we Black brothers, right? 18% went Trump. We went gangster. We went neo-fascist for a whole lot of reasons we can get into, machismo identities and so forth. Since 82 who didn't, but 18, that's a whole lot of Black brothers. But the sisters pushed it through, still Black, but gender here very important. But the fundamental thing I want to end on this is that if we're not dealing with the massive militarism, that's 60 cents for every dollar that goes to the military industrial complex, the militarism that Brother Martin reminded us of, and the inability of our two political parties, to come to terms with mass poverty, mass low quality education, mass incarceration. All the talk about voting in the world is just going to reinforce the legalized bribery and normalized corruption of so much American politics anyway. So we fight for the vote, but we got to tell Black people the truth. And the real fear is the young folks say, stay woke, Brother West, stay woke. Well, no, I don't want to suffer from insomnia now. I got to pace myself. I got to fortify myself. But you can also wake up and see a nightmare that you've been overlooking and then get disempowered. You see, because it's so overwhelming. White supremacy in its predatory capitalist and imperial expansionist forms can be overwhelming. All the lies, all the crimes, U.S. foreign policy, all the crimes of patriarchy, all the crimes of indigenous peoples and Black folk now and then, it can be overwhelming. You got to fortify yourself. That's why we got to start with Black love, Black joy, Black community, truth telling with one another, pushing each other against the wall, but still part of the great tradition. That's the jazz session, right? Monk can go this way. Earl Gardner can go this way. Fats gonna go this way. Mary Lou gonna go this way. They still part of the great tradition. They just got different ways and different voices. Let's lift every voice, not lift every echo. We just echoes, then we ain't gonna go nowhere. Then it's over. Fascists, we're gonna take over. But if it's voices, ooh, we got some voices that's unstoppable, unconquerable, and unsuffocateable. That's Black love right there, you see.
Another mic drop. Okay, so I hate to see us coming up to our last segment, but we never want to leave without a focus on where do we go from here. So we're going to have another quick check-in with Owoye Tempo. Give us a sense of what's resonating, Owoye.
Thanks so much, Kim. Well, people are definitely appreciating this phenomenal history lesson that you all are offering here. People have seen the master classes and think they're fantastic. And one person said, listening to these genius recountings and illuminations of history, it's baffling anyone wants to stay ignorant of these crucial events. But actually, kind of perfect transition for you, Kim. I'll just point out a couple of questions that have come up as well. One was, is there a way to out-organize and out-mobilize voter suppression? That person says, I don't think so. Someone else asked, how does understanding the history of the 15th Amendment allow us to connect anti-racism and democracy then and now? One person said, yes, Black voters have always been the dam against fascism and white supremacy with the 15th Amendment, but once again, how does this free us and where are we actually gaining? And lastly, someone said, we are losing faith in the law, losing faith in the courts, losing faith in what a democracy is supposed to mean. Is this the continued right approach, or is this just a route we are familiar with? So lots of questions swimming around in the chat as well, but very exciting and dynamic conversation.
Thank you, Owoye. So, Cornell, I'm going to come right back to you, particularly in light of the question about losing faith. You said from just your last comment about it's so much, so many fires at so many different levels, the ability to connect the dots and actually cover the bases and connect with one another and develop the sensibility that we can fight, we will win. It's difficult to sustain that, especially for those of us who are aware of how much was lost. Let's say at the end of the first Reconstruction, we had 20 years of reform. We had 6-7 decades of white supremacy that followed that up. We had a few decades of the civil rights, active forward momentum. And now we've had 40 years of retrenchment. We had 3 years let's even be more specific. We had about 3 months of active mobilization around George Floyd, and now we're in the 2nd year of retrenchment. So what do we learn from, lift out of this dynamic of reform, retrenchment? Where do we find the love that can fuel us moving forward? This is, I think your particular question, Cornell.
Well, I'll be brief. It's a beautiful and powerful question, though, but I just go back to our tradition. You see, just building on the magnificent voices of the great folk who came before. I begin with Irene and Clifton West, my parents, but I'll be a little bit more broader in that sense. When you think Du Bois, Negro cheer up, you can never win in America, I'm going to Ghana, international stage, right? International stage. Malcolm, pessimistic about America, international stage. We got the great David Lewis, thesis advisor, Brother Jelani. He laid out the whole stories of this radical tradition. Faith in American democracy must never foreclose our love for Black people and our willingness to transfer that tradition of love, joy, and freedom to the next generation as we improvisationally look for new ways out. There's never been a definitive way of Black people being free, because we ain't never been free fully. But it's the process of our struggle for freedom. That's where our spirit comes from. That's what our music is about. That's what the sparkle in grandmama's eye is all about. That's what the love and kindling in the heart of our children is all about. That's what's kept us going. So all this faith in democracy, faith in America, kiss my so-and-so, ain't nothing gonna get in the way of our love for Black people, our love for poor people. Period. We go down swinging. Don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing.
Jelani, let me come to you. And you said something that was so striking the other day, and I hope you'll, share it with our broader audience about tithing as a metaphor or analogy to understand something that a lot of our allies don't understand. And I'll just frame the conversation we were having this way. We were talking about how many of our allies are telling us that it is our insistence on racial justice discourse. It is our willingness to hold on to our history as a way of interpreting and understanding the present that has created the crises. It is that has persuaded the white working class to embrace Trumpism. So the more there's an embrace of Trumpism, the more there's discipline meted out against us for creating the conditions of inhospitality to white folk. And, we talked about, but that assumes that all the embrace of Trumpism is really about measurable interests. It can be rationally talked through, and our failure to do it is the problem. And you said something brilliant about tithing. Can you share that?
Yeah, so I think that when we're talking about this, we have this. We keep going back to this idea of people working against their own interests. And we're going back to this argument. It's like, oh, these people, they don't understand. They're going against their own interests. We just have to articulate to them that they're going against their own interests. And I said, what's happening here is like the non-believer in church. So the non-believer is in church and he observes a person come give their last $5, put it in the collection plate and say, this is an irrational act. This person could have used that money to get to work. They could have used that money to buy food. They could have done something reasonable with it, but instead they've taken this money and given it away. But the believer understands that this is a transaction, that what you have purchased with that is a renewed sense of your own commitment to your community, and you're willing to suffer. If you have to walk to work, then fine, you walk to work happily. If you have to skip your meal, you'll skip that meal happily, because you're in communion with something that's bigger, larger, and more important to you, so that's more fundamental to you than those things are. And so we have this conversation where we'll say, these people have done nothing for you. They have not helped your community. Look at the state of education and look at the state of healthcare. We don't have a Family Leave Act, all these things that you would benefit from, but instead you consistently vote for these people who don't act in your interest. And what's happening is that you're the non-believer. White supremacy is a faith. They're willing to tithe good education. They're willing to tithe healthcare. They're willing to tithe the things that would support them because they're getting a sacred transaction for them reaffirming the value of the community, their primary community that they belong to. So we have to understand that. Now, the fundamental point about this, though, is that notwithstanding, what we have seen in this country of populism, we talk about the populist tradition, and the radical white supremacist element of this, our conversation around the rise of Trumpism went immediately to George Wallace as his immediate predecessor. But we talk about George Wallace to the exclusion of talking about Henry Wallace. That there are two populist traditions in this country. One of them deeply invested in white supremacy, paranoid, reactionary, conspiratorial, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, all of those things. And that's a tradition we can trace back 1.5 centuries in this country. There is an equally long tradition of interracial populism, a populism that is inclusive, a populism that defines itself by all people having, not what they have is a zero-sum relationship to what I have. And so when we looked at those people in 2008, who suffered through the housing crisis and what that did to them, and you heard not a word from them, but they became outraged when Barack Obama was the president because they understood their status, not primarily by the condition of their housing, whether or not they lost their job, whether or not they got foreclosed, but whether or not they had the perception that Black people had something that they did not have. And so we look at people like Reverend William Barber, who is working deeply in that tradition, and that tradition that Dr. King was in fully at the end of his life with the Poor People's March, with that tradition that Henry Wallace in the 1940s, when he went through the country building an interracial coalition to push the Democratic Party to the left and embrace a politics that would deal with the least of these across the nation. When we go back to the original Populist Party, in its original version before it veered wildly into white supremacy, it was a party that was of white farmers that opposed lynching, that stood up and fought against lynching. And that is the tradition that we have to be mindful of. It's not a matter of trying to save people who understand their interests primarily to be their alignment with white supremacy, because those people are irredeemable as it stands. It is about building the coalitions with people who understand their own interests in ways that are fundamentally compatible with our own. And I think that is the most likely way that we effectively combat what we see in this resurgent tide of white supremacy.
Thank you so much, Jelani. And on that note, Sherilyn, let me come back to you for your remarks. And I want to pick up on this last part that Jelani said, identifying people with shared interests, who recognize the shared interests. And I think I want to put it this way, like, where is everybody? Right? So, last week, Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor at Texas, has tried to punish academics there who embraced academic freedom and passed a resolution that came from a template authored by AAPF and Association of University Professors to basically embrace the fundamental notions of academic freedom. In response to that, he's basically threatening to withdraw tenure. So, I see this and I think, okay, that's going to be the thing that brings everybody out. And it's kind of like crickets. I'm remembering all the free speech debates, the idea that, the response to hate speech is just more speech. Well, now it should be, the response to critical reflections on race should be, more speech, not necessarily what we're seeing. And I'm not seeing, some of those allies there. And lastly, I think, many people see the parallel of this moment. It's almost like PTSD. Those of us who lived through the affirmative action wars understand that this tactic that we're seeing is basically tried and true. We've seen it before. So now we're moving into a period where not only are these parallel, but they're about to overlap. So as the legal eagle of our generation, tell us what we need to understand about what we're in and what we need to be prepared to understand and to do in order to capture this moment and ensure that the history that we once saw play out does not play out again.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, we've taken this very seriously, to go back to the top of your opening. We see this for what it is, almost like I was describing us seeing what was happening with voter suppression before many people in the rest of the country were fully understanding it and seeing it. And we have to understand that I know what you're saying when you say where are the allies, that we would have expected this to be a front and center issue. I do think that the people who would normally be allied with us, many of them are in a bit of a state of shock. And that is because what has happened really over the last 7 or 8 years has been one of the most revelatory times about white supremacy and American democracy in my lifetime. It is almost as though the matrix is being revealed.
Mm.
Now, Black people have seen the Matrix for some time, so we're not in shock. We're basically saying what you're saying. This looks just like that. People climbing all over the Capitol. That looks like Colfax, right? We see the voter suppression. That sounds like Reconstruct, right? So we have analogs where we actually can make sense of what we're seeing in ways that I think many people who would normally be allied with us have not seen it, have not understood it. And what I think is critical for us is understanding that this great revelation, revealing, people can see all the strings of the little magic show of this country, right? Is that we have an opportunity to build from the ground up that which we actually want. At LDF, we're calling it, our work on the refounding. In other words, we're not reconstructing anything because we're not building over something that existed before. We're imagining the creation of the America that we would have made. And this pro-truth piece is part of it. Because if we're not careful, we will spend all our time fighting back against the passage of these laws without thinking about actually what is it that we want in place. It's not as though we think that the teaching of Black history was fantastic. If we're honest with ourselves, most of us learned so much of what we learned about Black history as adults. But there is something happening in this moment, Kim, and this goes back to the question you were asking of Dr. West. Sometimes the work is in us. Sometimes, we get worried about retrenchment. That's why people retrenching. But what's happening with us? This is a period in which we are learning more about ourselves than ever before, in which young people are transgressing some of the received wisdoms about American democracy, in which they're addressing issues of patriarchy and gender bias within our own communities, in which we're demanding self-care and not that we have to kill ourselves in doing the work and call it nobility. There's a lot that is happening in our own community. What we're demanding out of faith that doesn't exclude other people and so forth. We're doing some work, just as we did during the Nadir, when we were building institutions, Black institutions, and building our own infrastructure. So I think for people who are feeling like, oh, we're not making this progress, aren't we though? I think we are. I think the community of people that we are, what we believe, what we tolerate, what we don't tolerate, what we embrace and what we don't embrace is actually quite different than when I was a girl. And I'm excited and I'm proud about it, the things that we put on the table and named between and among ourselves. So we're doing some of that work so that we can do this refounding, so that we can build the world that we want and not just, as Dr. West said, emulate and copy that which we saw the master do up at the house. It is, we have to be equipped because this thing is so strong. And I think about this in the law as well, because if you are a lawyer, you are already part of an establishment. You've taken an oath, you've embraced aspects of the system. As you know, Kim, there are things we can say and things we can't say if we don't want to violate the ethical canons of being a lawyer. So we're already prescribed. But from within that position, aren't we thinking about the law in different ways? That's the challenge to CRT, to the extent they're even challenging CRT, is to challenge a refounding way of thinking about law, which is what CRT is. It is saying, take the truth of what we know, and we're going to use that as the sieve for everything we think of as law. And what comes out of that is going to be something completely different. So yes, they are fearful of that, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, which is why they're at the university and law school point as well. But I think it's also important for us to talk about what we're forestalling in the moment. And that's why LDF, and as you know, I'm just a few more weeks as president and director counsel at LDF. Janae Nelson is going to be the new president and director counsel, and she is all up in this pro-truth movement that you have played such a powerful role in. And we're deeply engaged at the grassroots level in a number of states, in South Carolina and Alabama and others, because we really believe that it is critical to activate parents and local Black leaders and communities around what they want out of their children's education. This is not just about how white people feel. We also have feelings about being excluded from the canon. So we're doing that deep work. There will be litigation for sure, and multiple pieces of litigation in multiple states pushing back against these laws, but also compelling a conversation about what these laws are about and strengthening ourselves in our own community to use this as the opportunity to think about what is it we actually want young people to be learning. And I'll just end with this because I started out talking about empathy. You know, when I was in the 6th grade, like many people, back in the 70s, I read The Diary of Anne Frank.
Mm.
And if you put that statute back up again, I felt guilt, I felt anguish, I felt discomfort, not because I'm German, not because I did anything to anybody. As a human being, it touched me in a place of shared humanity. When I read of Mice and Men, it touched me in a place of shared humanity. It wasn't that I felt guilt that I was not intellectually disabled like Lenny. It wasn't that I felt guilt about Anne Frank because I had done something. It was about being human being to human being, exactly what those people saw when they saw the video of George Floyd being killed. That when something wakes up in you that touches what wakes up in other people, and there's that moment of shared humanity, that's going to be the engine for the populism that Jelani is talking about. And that's going to be the leveraging of power way beyond our numbers. Black people are still 12% of the US population and not likely to rise much above that in the coming years. The leveraging of that power is going to come from that human to human contact. And so we recognize the importance of not letting them cut that off. And they're trying to cut it off in the young people. That's why they started with the K through 12. They don't want to lose their children to the project of white supremacy. They want their children to still be engaged and want to be part of that project of white supremacy. But they fear they will lose them if those children see the truth, hear the truth, and if those parts of humanity in their children are woken up within them. So that's a real danger that we have to face. We see it with how they lionize Kyle Rittenhouse, what 17-year-old wants their child to kill 2 people, regardless of what you thought the circumstances were. There is an effort to quell and to suppress the waking up of human empathy and the human condition. And that is part of why they are trying to strangle the truth about the struggle of Black people and the truth about white supremacy in this country. And so LDF is litigating. You're absolutely right. There should be more allies, but I think it's powerful to take it to them and ask them why they haven't awoken. Why is it that they could recognize every other free speech issue as being powerful and important and somehow are silent? Because they're in shock that the infrastructure that they're a part of and that they thought they had to just tinker around on the edges has shown itself to be rotten at the core.
Thank you so much, Sherilyn. And I want to say how absolutely proud we are to be working with the Legal Defense Fund on the Pro-Truth campaign, on Truth Be Told. I want to encourage any of our listeners who want to learn more, check out the LDF's website to learn about the work that they're doing. Check out the AAPF website to find materials and support some of these efforts by learning about it, making sure you know if these bans are coming to a school district near you, or if they're coming to a college or university near you, or if they're coming to a workplace near you. This effort to basically silence us, to make it impossible for us to testify as to our experience and the experience of this history, this country, is not unprecedented. We've seen it in the past. We see it happening now, and it's our responsibility to stop it. For myself, my hope is that the baton we pass to next generations isn't a partial one, isn't one that has been battered and beaten, and isn't one that has no words on it, right? We just pass them a material condition with no explanation for where it came from, and no sense that their people have fought it since we have been here. So, you know, even though I was thinking about trying to, you know, hang up the old shoes, I know there are a few more laps that we're all going to have to run to retake those batons and make sure that what we pass on is something that they can carry. I want to thank my amazing colleagues, friends, posse people, Sherilyn Eiffel, Cornell West, Jelani Cobb, for joining us today, for dropping mics all over the place, for their powerful, wide-ranging insights about our history, our current moment, and the struggle ahead. I'm so grateful for their time and their brilliance. And as always, I'd like to thank our team at the African American Policy Forum for the tireless work in putting together this event. Y'all see that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. It takes a village to create an event as seamless as this. So I thank you all, and special thanks to our very gracious partners at MasterClass, who put together the masterclass, who facilitated that series, and allowed us to use it as this evening's backdrop. And lastly, I want to thank all of you for joining us to keep these conversations going with your friends and families and with your communities. Please join us to fight to defeat these regressive and pernicious laws and strategies, and to elevate our rights to equity, equality, political participation in life itself. You can learn more about—
Kim, please tell the people to vote in school board elections and run for school board and show up at school board meetings.
Say your piece.
Listen,
no power on the table.
Listen, leave no power on the table. I know you're going to vote for the governor. I know you're going to vote for the senator. I know you're going to vote for the mayor. But I need you to vote in school board elections, and I need to know who you're voting for. That means you got to do a little research before you get inside the voting booth. There are elections every year, not every 4 years. Vote in school board elections. There's nothing to stop you from running for the school board. Run for the school board. And most importantly, show up at school board meetings. Sit in the seat. They act different when you're watching them. Show up. Make it your business that you're going to show up at 2 school board meetings this year. We've got to get engaged. We've got to exercise power differently. You can't just go to the booth on voting day and cast your ballot. We need you to do more. Leave no power on the table.
On the table.
And Mr. Kim, we want to salute Sister Sherilyn for her leadership, for her truth-telling, justice-seeking head of the Legal Defense Fund. Even if she passes on, you can see she still got the fire inside of her. We thank you for your service.
Thank you.
To our cause and to our people.
Thank you, Sherilyn. And let's just add one other thing, right? Run.
Run for school board.
Don't run away, run for. Run for school board. We need to have our voices in the mix. And I just want to throw out that my best friend Lisa Gissendanner was hanging out with all of us and ran for school board and won in Canton, Ohio. She's an inspiration to so many of us, and I hope she's an inspiration to you all as well. So you can learn more. And if you want to hear this program on a podcast, be on the lookout for this show on Intersectionality Matters. We will be posting it in coming weeks. And so I'm going to end with an announcement. AAPF won a gold award at this year's Anthem Awards for our collaboration with Janelle Monáe, Wonderland, and a collection of Black women artists for the release of the protest song, Say Her Name, Hell You Talking About? And so you'll be able to hear the song at the end of the credits of our show. But first, as we conclude, I want to close with some words of inspiration from 2 other of our esteemed MasterClass co-teachers, Nicole Hannah-Jones and Angela Davis. So until next time, stay safe as we continue to aspire to build a truly multiracial democracy.
There are 2 abiding factions in this United States of America. White supremacy is one and Black love is another. Because what we know is that white supremacists built a country that did not believe in equality, that did not believe all humans were deserving of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But Black people did believe those things. And Black people have had an almost unfathomable love for a country that has never loved us back the same in return. And that's a true love, right? A love that expects the best, but is also prepared for the worst.
I think it is so important for us to try to extricate ourselves from the idea that the measure of value is one human life. And that if it is not achieved in our lifetimes, it is not important. If people who were enslaved held those ideas, they would not have struggled so much. They were struggling for us. They were struggling for the possibility of a new world. If we imagine the ways in which people 100 years from now, 200 years from now, will be thankful to us for doing the work that we are doing today, then that means that we will have played a part in the production of that future and that we will be spiritually present in that future.